There are times in life where the loudest voice in the room is not the one which holds power or experience or age, but the one that has the courage to speak because of pure love. This tale starts in a silent Georgia courtroom where an unlikely figure, a boy not more than 10 years old, dressed in a jacket too large for him, stood up and spoke something so authentic, so unyielding, that it froze the whole room. What took him there? Well, sometimes life squeezes ordinary families into impossible places, not because they have done anything wrong, but because they are struggling to survive with honor. This wasn't about heroics or headlines. It was about a son observing closely as his mother struggled to keep things together, feeling powerless until he finally realized that he wasn't going to watch anymore. Have you ever witnessed a person step into courage not because they were prepared, but out of necessity? Have you ever seen love manifest in a manner so humble and relentless, it changes the course of destiny? That's what this book contains. At its core is a struggling mother by the name of Melinda, pulled taut between two careers, attempting to scrape together resources to live for her son, Elijah. They didn't own much, but what they did have, they held dear: hot meals, frayed books, and the sort of love that appears day after day without fail. And then, out of nowhere, a notice on the door, a letter in red, stamped with legal language, threatening to evict them from their home over a technicality. No lawyer, no alternative, just a harsh letter and a deadline. What comes next isn't a story of miracles, but of purpose, of a boy who quietly starts to learn law after school, not because he was told to, but because he saw the terror in his mother's eyes. He reads books too thick for his small fingers, streams online court hearings on a creaky library computer, and writes notes late at night while the world is sleeping. He doesn't say much to anybody. He just continues to show up, daily a little more courageous, a little more knowledgeable, driven by nothing more than passion. And when the moment actually arrives to appear before a judge, he does so not with the sheen of a pro, but with the unembellished honesty of one who knows what really counts. It's a moment in that courtroom when something uncommon occurs, something that transcends rules and regulation. It becomes a moment when truth is spoken, not because it's articulated flawlessly, but because it's unmistakably true. It's a tale about voice, gaining it, wielding it, and learning what it can really accomplish. It's about how love prepares us to venture into rooms we never knew were open to us, to battle wars we never prepared for, and to bear down for one another when the world grows hard. But above all, it's about the kind of fortitude forged in the wee hours of the morning in kitchen, in hushed prayers and weary hands, the type of strength that doesn't yell, but stays. And today, as we accompany Elijah and Melinda on this indelible journey, perhaps it will remember us, parents, children, neighbors, strangers, about the time that the most heroic things may start with one quiet choice to care. So sit with me a while, and let me tell you what happened when a little boy looked up at a judge and said, "I'm here to speak for my mom." You ever see a moment so real, so unplanned, that time itself freezes? That is precisely what transpired on a quiet Tuesday morning within a humble county courtroom just beyond Atlanta, Georgia. It was one of those routine days, overcast skies, gentle murmurs of papers shuffled, and the judge going systematically over an extended list of cases pending with the type of weariness associated with 4-decade public service. Lawyers rested back in their chairs, clerks clicked away at their keyboards, and a few weary individuals occupied the benches, patiently awaiting their chance to be heard. And then in the midst of it all, something occurred that no one could have possibly anticipated. A kid, no more than 10 years old, rose from his seat in the back pew. His suit jacket was too large, sleeves draping over his hands, shoulders dipped slightly from the burden of it. But the posture, there was something there. A quiet confidence that didn't correspond with his size or his age. He cleared his throat softly, approached the wooden railing carefully, and stood straight ahead. Then, with a steady and respectful voice, he spoke. "Your Honor, I'm my mom's attorney today." You could sense the air in the room change. Initially, there were some giggles that rose up, a soft, uncomfortable laughter from the bailiff and a couple of people at the back. Surely this was a joke, a kid presenting himself as the legal representative of someone. It had to be a mistake. But then they glimpsed him. His expression didn't waver. His gaze didn't shift. He wasn't joking. He wasn't acting. The judge, a somewhat older man, with a reputation for being blunt, slowly removed his glasses and leaned forward over the bench, eyebrows slightly raised in both surprise and curiosity. "Son, repeat that," he asked, voice low, but authoritative. The boy nodded, not with terror, but with sure conviction. "I'm here to represent my mom," he said again. "She can't hire a lawyer, and no one else would represent her. So I studied up, and suddenly the room that was already full of routine felt like the hub of something big." Lawyers put down their pens. Phones ceased ringing. Even the judge lingered a bit longer than normal before answering. Because what they had seen before them wasn't just a little boy being brave. It was a young man rising up when nobody else would. And for an instant, every grown-up in that room, every person with years of life behind them was reminded of what courage truly is. Now let me step back and explain how we became involved in this courtroom on this unforgettable morning, because this tale doesn't start with a judge or a courtroom. It starts in a tiny, slightly faded apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, where Elijah Thomas, age 10, and his mother, Melinda, resided. Their home wasn't luxurious. 2 cramped bedrooms, a dim, shaky hallway light that never seemed to stay lit, and a kitchen that always had a hint of coffee and hope. Melinda was a single mother, the type of woman who held too much on her plate, but never for one moment let it show in her smile. She worked 2 jobs, both tough and underpaid: overnight shifts at a nearby nursing home, and weekends folding and sorting at a laundromat. She didn't have much in terms of money or time, but what she gave Elijah was something deeper: love, stability, and a fierce sense of right and wrong. Every night she came home, dog-tired, and still asked Elijah about his day. They'd share instant noodles, laugh at silly old sitcoms, and even on the hardest nights, she'd whisper to him, "Mom, we're gonna make it. Just you wait." Life wasn't simple, but it was their own. Then one morning, a thick envelope showed up at their front door. In it was a formal letter from the landlord, alleging Melinda had broken the terms of the lease. Her transgression, allowing her younger sister Clarissa to stay for a few weeks after she lost her job and apartment. Melinda had brought her in out of pity, just long enough to get her back on her feet. Clarissa was gone already weeks ago, but that didn't bother the landlord. He wanted them out, asserted she'd violated the rules by harboring an unauthorized occupant. No warning, no discussion, just stiff paper and a date marked in red: eviction hearing in 14 days. Melinda was shocked. She attempted to speak to the landlord, tell him the story, beg his understanding, but he would not listen. She looked for assistance, contacted legal aid, but they were understaffed and overburdened. Private attorneys were well beyond her means. That evening, once Elijah had eaten and retired to bed, so she believed, Melinda sat at the kitchen table by herself, her head in her hands, the notice of eviction crumpled under her elbows. A solitary tear fell onto the page. She did not weep, did not bellow. She sat there silently defeated, overcome, spent, terrified. She muttered under her breath, "Lord, I don't know what else to do." What she didn't realize was that across the hall, Elijah lay awake, the gentle whir of the old box fan in his room muffling the distant sound of his mother crying. He had never heard her like this. She was his rock, his everything. And in that instant there, in his twin bed with Star Wars bedding and a knot in his throat, Elijah made a choice. A large one. He had no money. He had no connections. But what he did possess was a profound devotion to his mom, and the sort of resolve most folks twice his age could only hope to imagine. He was going to assist her. Somehow, some way, he was going to fight back. The very next afternoon after school, as most children tore home to play video games or throw a ball around, Elijah Thomas strolled with quiet intent along the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood and into the cool, still halls of the local library. But he did not go to the children's area, where comic books and brightly colored picture books lined the shelves. No, Elijah strode past the toy box into the dusty shelves marked law and government. He didn't really have any idea what he was searching for, just that in those big books somewhere could be an answer, a solution to aid his mom. The words filled the pages and were too difficult for most 10-year-olds to speak, much less comprehend. But Elijah wasn't about to let that dissuade him. He pulled up into a corner table, opened the largest book he could handle, and began to read, slowly, carefully, line by line. Miss Carter, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who had worked there for decades, spotted him and inquired if he was okay.
Elijah shook his head initially, prideful, stubborn, but soon came back with a notebook and whispered, "Do you have something easier to read?" From that point on, Miss Carter worked quietly with him. She explained to him where to access eviction law materials, brought up local pamphlets on tenant rights, and assisted him in logging onto the public computer to browse the web for court proceedings. Elijah soaked it up like a sponge. He watched video after video of eviction hearings, dozens of them, observing how tenants argued, how judges reacted, and what made arguments effective. He discovered a retired law professor on YouTube who explained legal jargon in simple English and bookmarked all of them. He paused, rewound, took notes. At night, he'd stand in front of his broken bathroom mirror, reciting declarations, imagining he was in court, adjusting his posture, working on his voice. "Your Honor, if I may," he'd repeat, ad infinitum. He wrote down on napkins, school worksheets, even the reverse sides of grocery bills. At school, when other children were swapping baseball cards or discussing cartoons, Elijah would slip into the computer lab at lunch and type out a formal message. It wasn't elegant, but it was compelling. A combination of facts, feeling, and unvarnished truth. He printed it out on his lunch money and folded it up in his backpack neatly. He took a dictionary from Miss Carter so he could learn important vocabulary like burden of proof and lease violation. Day by day, hour by hour, he constructed not only a case, but his bravery. Word spread around the neighborhood quietly that Elijah was doing something amazing. A neighbor, Mr. Reggie, who retired from being a tailor, heard about it and gave Elijah an old navy blue suit jacket. It was a bit large around the shoulders, but it made Elijah feel tough, significant.
When Elijah presented the suit to his mother, she stood frozen there, confronted with pride and fear both at once. "Baby, you don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not your job to correct this." But Elijah just sat there looking at her with the cool serenity of someone many years his senior. "You always battle for me, Mama," he spoke gently. "Now let me battle for you." She wanted to tell him no, wanted to shield him from the coldness of courtrooms and lawyers' jargon. But in that instant, as she gazed at her son standing tall in his too large jacket, clutching a folder full of notes and printouts, she knew this wasn't about paperwork. This was about something more. This was about love appearing at the right time. And as the date of the court approached, while others prepared for another frigid eviction hearing, Elijah Thomas was getting ready to stand up for his home, to be sure, but also for the woman who had always been there for him. In that same subdued Georgia courtroom so many years before, the tension was palpable. The air had grown thick with anticipation. Everyone waited with bated breath for Elijah, who stood before the room in his huge blue blazer, clutching his papers to himself, but holding himself upright. The judge, who had seen it all from bloody felonies to loud neighbor lawsuits between worldly years, looked at Elijah for what seemed like a very, very long time. It wasn't contempt that he saw. It was something akin to amazement, perhaps even respect. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke, his tone measured and quiet. "Okay, son," he said slowly. "Proceed." Elijah's hands shook ever so minimally as he advanced, but when he took the plunge and spoke, his voice was solid, clear, and strong. He started by identifying himself, not as an attorney, but as a son attempting to assist his mother. He clarified, using words he had rehearsed 100 times, that his Aunt Clarissa had not been staying with them long-term, only for a few weeks while between jobs and houses. He brandished a letter carefully creased, signed by Clarissa herself and dated, to prove that she had departed long before the notice was served. He cited the lease, noting that the unauthorized occupants clause permitted temporary visitors, and that nothing had been changed or compromised permanently. His voice never broke, his eyes never blinked. The room had fallen completely still, except for the swiveling of a few heads and the quiet clacking of the court clerk's keyboard. And then Elijah paused, took a deep breath, and looked the judge square in the eye. What he said next didn't come from any law book or online video. It came straight from the heart. "Your Honor," he said, voice a little softer now, "we're not trying to break rules, we're just trying to live. My mom works all night. She pays her rent, she follows the rules, she just didn't want her sister to sleep on the street. That's not wrong. That's family. There it was, the moment that changed everything. You could feel it. The bailiff who had chuckled before, now leaned forward just a little, his brow furrowed. The lawyer for the landlord, a tall man in a sharp gray suit, shifted in his seat, looking down at his notes like they no longer made sense. Even the landlord, sitting toward the front, folded his arms and turned away. The judge rocked back in his chair and didn't react immediately. He simply sat there for an extended period of time, lightly tapping a pen against the desktop, as though considering the boy's words not only against codes of law, but against something more fundamental, human decency. Then, with a slight nod and a sigh, he uttered something that would be remembered by all of those in the room. Son, you might not be a lawyer on paper, but you've done your homework. And more importantly, you've reminded this courtroom what justice looked like. He confronted the landlord, voice now more firm, all the gravitas of the gavel in his voice. This family has not broken the lease in any substantive way. Transitory guests are not a basis for eviction. Case dismissed, and that was it. But it didn't feel like a straightforward verdict. It felt like a gentle victory, a moment where love, courage, and truth had been louder than fear or authority. A soft intake of breath reverberated through the courtroom. A woman in the back placed her hand to her mouth. Melinda, sitting a few rows behind Elijah, breathed out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. And then she lost it, tears streaming down her face, hands clasped to her mouth, as she gazed at her son. Not shock, but pride, pure, drenched, heart-exploding pride. Elijah looked at her and smiled, softly, knowingly, but not a wide, triumphant grin, because he hadn't done it to be a hero. He hadn't done it to be praised or seen. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do, because he loved his mother. And in that courtroom, in the presence of strangers, suits, and files of legal documents piled high like walls, a young boy had stood guard for the woman who had always stood guard for him. No fanfare. No headline. No, only love, doing what love does best, standing tall, even when the odds are stacked high. Once the judge's gavel fell, and the case was dismissed, something remarkable took place, something that reminded everyone in that courtroom, and ultimately far beyond it, that courage and grace are not always bestowed upon those wearing badges or possessing longevity, but sometimes upon the most unlikely of hearts. As Elijah and Melinda emerged into the hallway, heads turned. Individuals, strangers moments earlier, stood and applauded softly. Some extended their hands to shake, some hugged, and several had tears streaming down their faces. An older woman, with a flowered top, tapped Melinda's arm and said, barely above a whisper, "Your boy, he's something special." The bailiff, now looking guilty for ever having chuckled, nodded in respect. Even the landlord's own lawyer came up and nodded and whispered, "You have a future, young man." The word spread fast, at first in whispers and phone calls, and then through a local news reporter who was there. When the anchor heard of a 10-year-old who successfully represented his mother in court and won, they sent a camera crew the next morning. The episode that night, Little Lawyer with a Big Heart. And in an instant, Elijah's story appeared in the living rooms of Georgia, and soon the nation. Calls began pouring in. A local charity that dealt with housing stability came to the rescue and provided Melinda and Elijah with a new home, one that was safer, cleaner, and nearer to Elijah's school. A tiny church congregation raised money for new clothes, groceries, even a laptop for Elijah so he could keep on learning. But Elijah remained humble throughout it all. He was still a child, after all. He still enjoyed Saturday morning cartoons, coasting down the sidewalk on his bike, and snatching spoonfuls of cookie dough when his mom wasn't around. But something inside of him had shifted, had grown. He started carrying himself with quiet determination, the sort you don't usually find in someone as young. He started visiting the library, more and more, not only to prepare for law, but to assist other children with their homework. He informed Miss Carter, the librarian, that he wanted to start a book club named Young Advocate so children could discover their rights and stand up when something didn't seem right. And occasionally, someone from the news or a neighborhood magazine would approach him and ask, "Elijah, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And he'd grin, not bashful, but proudly, and respond, I want to be a lawyer. Not any lawyer. I wish to start a law firm for moms like mine. The elegance of it wasn't in what he was saying, it was in how he said it. Not with pride or ego, but with profound, lived wisdom. He'd witnessed what terror looked like in the eyes of his mother, what silence sounded like when you feel you have no voice. And he had made up his mind, only 10 years old, that no one was ever alone in facing it. For Melinda, things changed too. She stood a bit taller now, not because their struggles had gone away, but because she had seen her son walk into the kind of strength that alters individual, not the one demonstrating all those around them as well. She would frequently say to friends, I raised him, but he raised me right back. And in a world that sometimes loses sight of strength of compassion, of doing the right thing, simply because it's right, Elijah's tale became a reminder, a source of hope. Folks wrote letters from out of state. A retired judge mailed him a stack of law books with a handwritten note. You've got what it takes, son. Keep going. And as the weeks turned into months, that courtroom moment became more than just a victory for one family. It became a lesson for an entire community. A lesson in what can occur when love arrives on time. When a kid is convinced he can bring about change, and when the world slows down long enough to pay attention. Elijah's case was far from, but even if he never testified again in another courtroom, he had already established one of life's biggest. You don't require a badge of honor to tell that. You only require the heart to care and the courage to stand up. Life puts us in situations we did not ask to be in. Quiet wars waged behind doors, times when the whole world has been so heavy for weary hands to bear. But every once in a while, courage comes disguised in the most unlikely guise. It does not arrive in armor or with big speeches. Occasionally, it arrives in the firm tone of a child, a big-sleeved little boy, and an even bigger, standing bravely before a judge to defend the sole person who's ever stood. Elijah's tale is more than one of laws and courtroom. It's one of what occurs when love is not willing. It's about a mother moving heaven and earth to keep her son safe, and about a son not allowing the world to take it safe. And though we tend to imagine courage as being loud or heroic, sometimes it's quiet, in mumbled prayers, all-night study sessions in the back of a library, or a simple affirmation spoken conviction. We're not trying to break, we're just trying to live. One simple sentence, spoken with the conviction, 10-year-old boy, reminds us all of something that we too readily forget. That justice isn't merely a system, it's a feeling, a value, a principle we embody in the way that we treat each other. Elijah wasn't legally trained. He didn't have the benefit of years of schooling. But what he did possess was something much stronger, conviction, clarity, and love. And that love moved mountains. In a world that can sometimes seem hard and multi-load, this tale reminds us that the loudest voice, when it is filled with truth and compassion, has the power to resonate more loudly than the greatest throng. It reminds us that love does not stand by while someone is in pain. Love rolls up its sleeves, does the homework, appears in court, and pleads with all the might it can, because love believes, love battles, love studies, and at the end of the day, love triumphs, sometimes in ways we could not see coming. So whether you're a parent, a neighbor, a teacher, or just someone trying to do the right thing, remember this: even in the hardest moment, the purest kind of strength is born, not from power, but from purpose. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is the courage to stand up and say, I'll be there, I'll speak up, I won't let you face this alone.